Yo guys, and welcome back to another week of me building a self-tracking app in Svelte 5. And for this week I continued working where we left off in the previous week, working on the analytics view. So if you didn't watch the last video, there I explained how I coded the actual backend for the analytics view, how to crunch the numbers and actually come up with these metrics. But for this week, I focused mainly on putting it all together in Svelte and actually started displaying things in the front end. So this is what we have here. We have a little analytics view, and from within here we can see trackables, tags, and correlations. These are the three different alternate views that we have to see between. For the trackables, we can just see all of the trackables and their values. So here we can see, for example, my daily steps. And this also highlights the difference between a quantitative value and a categorical value. So the numerical values we just display a line chart for, but for the categorical values here, the food type, we can see that it actually shows a pie chart instead with the different categories that we have. If we now click in on one of these trackables, we can see some more information, some of the good stuff, right? So we can see a more large scale picture of this line chart that we had, but we can also see the average value. So we can see the average daily mood value. We can also see the max value and when it occurred. So we can actually see the actual date on which I felt the best and also the date on which I felt awful. So we can see that here, and the idea is also that we should be able to click these buttons to jump back to the journal and actually see the day in its entirety, so we can see perhaps why we were feeling so awful on this particular day and see perhaps if there's anything we can do to avoid feeling that way again. But we also have then the weekdays, for example. We can see on which weekday that I feel the best. And it was particularly this Monday the 3rd. We can see we had a 10 here, but this is of course average. So if we have multiple weekdays or multiple values for different weekdays, it will be averaged up. Like you can see here, 3.5 on a Thursday. But we can also then see on which weekdays we feel the best. And then of course we also have the correlation. So before we had this really boring debug view, now we actually have some proper correlation cards where we can see some of the meaningful correlations. So we can see, for example, that my mood, how are you feeling, is actually greater after days with greater steps. So we can see that we have a 98% confidence, and that is just from the Pearson correlation that I was talking about in the previous video. So you can see a pretty strong correlation between the fact that I have higher mood after days when I take more steps. And we can also then down here see the negative correlations. And then we can also of course click on this little chart icon here and see the actual days. So we can see, for example, that on this day I took some amount of steps. This is of course normalized from 0 to 1, so we can't actually see the actual value, but we can see here that we did take a lot of steps, and that resulted in the next day having good mood. Here I took fewer steps, that resulted in us having very low mood, and here we take again a little bit more steps, and that resulted in better mood. And this also correlates to the actual journal that we have. We have perhaps 12,000 steps here, then we have high energy. Here we took 4,000 steps, and the next day I was feeling worse. So you can see that there is a correlation between the steps and how I am feeling, and this is also now being shown in the correlations with 98% confidence. I also went ahead and added tag entries, so that's something I did add to the backend for this week. The fact that we can have tags and correlate with tags. For example, here I tagged enthusiastic on days where I also felt good. So we can see that when I then tagged enthusiastic, my mood tended to be higher. So we can also see a correlation between tags and quantitative values. And of course, we can also switch here to a different form question if we're interested in perhaps the what type of exercise did you do. Then you can see the correlations for that particular form question. We can see here that I often tend to track this as cardio when the calories is greater. So you can see the frequency when I track cardio, the calories burned tends to be higher. And this is also within the same form. So both of these questions belong to the same form. They're not from different forms. And we can see that this is also true in the journal. When I track cardio, we have a lot of calories burned. When I track something else like biceps, we have not as much calories burned. So we have a correlation between the fact that I log a cardio and how many calories I have burned. I also started implementing this tags view. It's definitely not completed. This heat map is just showing random values for now. And I should also probably widen it a bit. It looks really odd when we have so few columns, but these many rows. But here we can see all the tags, and here you're supposed to see for each day if it is tagged or not. But I can perhaps click in on Sleepy here and see the correlations for Sleepy as well. So we can see that Sleepy is often tagged when it is Thursday, and that is simply because we have correlations for weekdays as well. Even if we do calculate it separately, we want to be able to still do correlations so that we can show this in other places than in just this view. We might want to show it on we might want to show it in the dashboard view. We might have found this new correlation that I start tagging Sleepy whenever it is Thursday. So that's why I want to have a different data set for Thursdays. And then we also have an overview of all the correlations in the system under this nice little correlations view. And here we can see all of the correlations that we have found in the whole system, with a bunch of filtering options as well to make it a bit more useful for the user. If they want to see perhaps only the numerical or the quantitative correlations, then they can get rid of them, and we can see that only the mood and the steps correlations are now showing up. We can also have numerical and weekdays, there were none of those. Perhaps tags and weekdays, and then we can see that, yeah, we have Sleepy tagged when it is Thursday. And here we can also adjust the confidence levels that we want to show. Perhaps we want to show less confident correlations. Then we can pull this slider down and notice that, yeah, in fact, there are a lot of these correlations. Some of them are more useful than others. Some of them are more true than others. So if you want to look at that, then you can pull down this slider. But if you want to see only the confident correlations, then you can also see those here, and they are more confident because the Pearson correlation simply says that these variables are more correlated. So how was this actually implemented in Svelte? Well, we are doing something very similar to how we have done every other view, where we have different dynamic components that we want to change between based on a value. So based on this analytics view type, this view type state, we show a different component here. So we show either the trackable or the tag or the correlation view. And then we have our basic segmented control that simply switches out the view. And since this is derived, it's reactive, and then we can render a different component based on the view that we want to show. So for example, we have the analytics trackable view. And the way that I did this was actually to create a new store. I definitely want to keep my logic away from the components as much as possible, because I don't want to bloat up these components. They should be focused on the view parts solely. If I have a button that I click, then I might have an event handler, but I don't want to do lots of number crunching and constructing charts, and doing all of that stuff could definitely be done outside of the view. We don't need to couple it that tightly to the view, for example. So for this, we have a trackable analytics store where we actually do come up with these results. We have a trackable analytics result, which contains the trackable and contains the chart for the trackable and also the settings that we have. And how does this trackable analytics work? Well, we have an analytics result, and this analytics result actually comes from a store that I also created. I created an analytics store. So in fact, we're actually calculating all of the analytics when the page loads. I have not yet decided on when I want to be calculating these analytics, but we want them to be available when the user clicks in on the page preferably. We could perhaps also be storing them in the database. We might not need to calculate the analytics every time the user visits the application, but it's of course nice to have it available and have the most recent version available. But if we have a lot of analytics, it will definitely slow down the app, so we might not do that in the future. But when we are constructing this, we are fetching the analytics for that and storing it in the store. Now we can just derive the analytics store and get the analytics result. We just await it, because this is also a promise that we can then await in the Svelte code to show a loading indicator when it is not ready. And here we simply loop over all the trackables that we also have in the trackables store, but we also fetch the values that we have calculated for it in the analytics results. We calculated all values for all trackables in the whole system here. So we have access to that from the analytics result. We can find the specific values for that specific trackable, and then also construct a chart from this, for example. Here we just convert the values based on if it's supposed to be a mean. We also have our analytics detail view, and this is where we actually get into the nitty-gritty, the more detailed analytics like the weekdays and the correlations and everything like that. So for that we have two different views based on if it's a trackable or if it's a tagged. When we mount the view, we first try to check what kind of entity type it is, and then we map that to a specific component that we want to render, very similar to the other view that we had. For this analytics trackable details view, then we actually have another store, of course. I love my Svelte store, so we have a trackable detailed analytics where we pass in the ID, the question ID that we want to show, and also the time scope based on if it's daily, weekly, or monthly that we want to see analytics for. And this detailed analytics store is pretty similar. The only difference here is that we also need to differentiate. If we have a different time scope than daily, or perhaps if we have a different range in the future, we need to actually get specific analytics. We need to recalculate all of the analytics, because the base, the cached value that we calculate when the app loads is just for 30 days. It's only for the daily analytics that we have. So if we switch out the time scope, we definitely need to calculate new analytics for that. And here again, we use the fat analytics result. We fetch the specific trackable, we fetch the raw values, and we also then calculate things like basic analytics for getting average, min, or max, but we also calculate the weekday analytics for showing on which weekday I perhaps took the most steps and things like that. And then we just resolve back a nice object that we can easily render in the front end. So this is what it's all about. We want to do all of the nasty mapping and looping, and all of that happens far away from the Svelte components themselves. And the Svelte components can just do a nice render with some sensible markup. But here we also have the correlation message, which is simply this message here. We have how long did you work out after days with enthusiastic tag, and we need to be able to construct that message. All of that happens in these utility functions that we have here. We have convert key. So the result key actually contains things like the form questions, or the tag ID, or the categorical values that we have correlated, and all of that is stored and serialized into a string. Then we need to simply deserialize this and actually fetch the more sensible human readable values. For example, the form name or the tag name. So based on what it starts with, if the key starts with tag, then we know that we should fetch the tag by its ID, and then we can say that the entity type is the tag name, and the message, the human readable, is the tag name was tagged. And we have things like after days with. So all of that good stuff happens in here. It's definitely not complete. The messages could be more sensible, more useful, but this is a good starting point for somewhat readable messages that the user can actually understand. Welcome back to another day. So I just did some finishing up for this week. I added some nice colors here. It was looking a bit dull before when all of the charts had the same colors. Now we're just generating a random color for each of these charts to just differentiate them a little bit easier in the view. I also added this settings button that I was talking about. So now I can switch out what kind of question I want to be showing. If I want to see instead the chart for how long did you exercise for, well then I can change that. How long did you exercise for? Save that. We can see that now instead we get a line chart, so it's a little bit easier for the user to decide what kind of metric they want to show on the analytics view. They can also change the average value settings, so if they don't want to use average values for calculating something. An example here is this hydration, where you will probably log hydration multiple times during a day. You want that to be summed up. You want to say that you perhaps drank 2000 milliliters of water or something during that day, not an average of how much you drank during that day. If we take a look at this day, we can see that we have actually 1000 milliliters of water on this Friday, but it's showing up here as 500 because that is 1000 divided by 2. But we can change this so that it's not using an average value, so we can do just uncheck that. Now you can see that it shows the sum instead, which is 1000, and this is also taking into consideration in all of the other scenarios in the correlations, in the weekdays calculations. All of that now uses the sum instead of the average. I also implemented the tag heat maps properly, so now we can see a heat map of whenever we have tagged a specific tag. We can go in here and tag enthusiastic. If we reload because we need to recalculate the analytics, then we will see that the most recent day is now green instead. I also added a detailed view for this one, not much more than what the other one looks like. We have a heat map here in a bit larger scale. We also have the weekdays and the correlations just like usual. I also added another system for the correlations, which is the new correlation. So we want to perhaps see that a new correlation has popped up. So we want to give more significance to correlations that the user has not already seen. Perhaps a new theme starts occurring. Maybe they start sleeping less. Then they want to see that this new correlation, even if it perhaps has lower confidence than other correlations in the system, just because it is newer, it is more relevant. So we're simply keeping track of all of these correlations and when they first started appearing. And then we check the difference in the correlation coefficient. So if the correlation coefficient changed drastically, or if it simply just started appearing, then they will have a more recent timestamp, which will favor them in showing them in the sidebar here. So we can see the more new insights, the new correlations that the system has detected. I also fixed the journal so that we now can see the tags in the journal, so we can actually unlog them from the journal as well. I also started treating both of these entries as entities instead. So now I can actually select both tags and form entries and delete all of them if I wanted to. So that should hopefully make things even more useful for the user if they want to batch delete some of their entries. There was actually quite a lot of work involved in making this work with both journal entries and tag entries, because we might have an uneven array being returned. When we are paginating these journal entries, we might actually have more journal entries than we have tag entries. And that simply means that we're going to have uneven. We're going to have days where we're not going to be seeing all of the tag entries or all of the journal entries, because we're fetching more future tag entries. Maybe we fetch 50 tag entries and one of them is like super far off in the past. We're gonna see a day that is empty that contains only that tag entry, even though there might be journal entries on that day. So here I had to change this up. So then we find the most recent entry of the two so that we can filter out any older entries for the other data sets, so that we don't get these ghost days where we actually have entries that are just not showing up because they're not part of the pagination result. I also significantly improved the efficiency of this in IndexedDB, because previously we were fetching all of the entries in the whole database and sorting them and slicing them in JavaScript code. But now we're actually fetching below or equal to a specific timestamp, but we're limiting it, but we are limiting the results, that we're not fetching more than we have to. So now we're actually sorting by both the timestamp and the ID. And this is what I was missing before, that I was just sorting based on timestamp. But the problem is that we might have multiple entries on the same day, and then we will get a random order. It will not be deterministic. But if we sort both on the timestamp and the ID, we will first sort by timestamp and then we sort by ID, we will get back deterministic results. Then we can limit it and make sure that it's below or equal so that we don't include the same entries twice. So this is definitely a much better way of doing pagination in IndexedDB. I actually also got rid of the form name and the form icon from my journal entries. I felt that it was quite a bit redundant to be storing this data in the database as well. When we can simply fetch it dynamically, I think it actually makes more sense to perhaps in the store like I'm doing right now. If we take a look inside of a grouped, I think here we are fetching the forms, we are fetching the tags, and this simply means that we can dynamically fetch the form name, form icon, and the tag name based on perhaps the form ID and the tag ID that we are saving. We don't need to redundantly store this in the journal entries because journal entries will be the fattest collection in the database. It will have the greatest storage size. So we don't need to be bloating it up with two unnecessary strings for the name and icon of the form. When we can dynamically fetch it, it will be quite quick. We won't have like a million forms in the system to fetch. We do this on the load of the journal, and then we can just reuse that whenever we are loading more entries. So I think this is more efficient and actually just better. But that's all that I had time to implement for this week. But I'm actually happy with how the analytics view is coming along. I think it's time to maybe start working on other aspects, things like the dashboard, for example, where we will also have analytics. We will have things like the new insights, the new correlations. We want to have a widget for that. I feel like a dashboard view is what's going to tie everything together and actually make a coherent application out of the goals and habits and trackables and tags and everything. So I think that's what I want to focus on a bit more on in the next week. I think this is a good MVP for the analytics, a minimum viable product. This is kind of showcasing how to do correlations, how to do some basic quantitative and categorical analytics and weekday analytics. This is a good starting point and actually provides some useful metrics for the data that we have in the system. So I hope that you guys want to follow along for next week. Also feel free to check out the code on GitHub and join my Discord channel if you want to be part of the community that I'm trying to build. But other than that, I'll see you guys next week. Peace out.